And if you know what Oscar Davis would eventually mean to Baldwin County politics, then you already know this wasn't just some random man wandering into a union fight. Oscar Davis was a businessman, a former brick mason, a man with roots in the Milledgeville black community. And somewhere along the way, he appears to have understood something bigger was happening here. The fight at J.P. Stevenson wasn't only about a paycheck. It was becoming a fight over who had power, who had representation, and whether black working people in Milledgeville could organize themselves without somebody in authority trying to control the outcome. And that's where James Orange entered the picture. And Oscar would help connect Orange with Reverend E.D. Strickland, the president of the local NAACP and chairman of the local LCLC affiliate. Now you got something different forming. This isn't just two union organizers staying at the Holiday Inn anymore. You've got organized labor beginning to connect with established black leadership inside of Milledgeville. And then there's another name, Dr. C. Wayman Alston. Alston was a profound black man. He was an ordained Baptist minister. And we don't have to guess about whether he had professional standing in this community. Central State Hospital's own 1972 annual report and yearbook lists C. Wayman Alston, BD, as clinical chaplain. And understand what that meant at Central State. This wasn't simply somebody showing up on Sunday to preach. Central State described its chaplaincy services as providing pastoral care, counseling, religious evaluations, and accredited clinical pastoral education as part of the hospital's treatment system. So Dr. Alston was educated, professionally established, active in the black community, and politically connected and characterized as a political strategist. And at one point, he and Mayor Robert Rice were allies. Alston had helped Rice politically. Rice had received significant black support, and according to historical record, Rice had even positioned Alston as a liaison of sorts, encouraging local industry to utilize him in dealing with issues involving black employees. But here's where the relationship begins to break. Austin expected progress. He expected black people to begin gaining meaningful opportunities inside city government. He expected women to have opportunities. And over time, Austin became convinced that those promises were not being fulfilled. By 1978, the man who had once helped Robert Rice politically was publicly criticizing the direction of his administration. And Austin knew something else. He knew about the surveillance. For more than a year, people connected to the union campaign had been watched. I want to stop right there for a second because when we say somebody was watched, it can sound almost harmless 50 years later. Right? So put yourself there, Milledgeville, Georgia, mid 1970s. You're black. You work at one of these factories. The factory check pays your rent, feeds your children, keeps the lights on, and maybe even helping somebody else in your family survive too. Somebody tells you there's a meeting at the Holiday Inn about organizing a union. Maybe you're committed to joining, maybe you're not. Hell, maybe you're just curious. You drive up there, you park, you go inside. And unbeknownst to you, somebody connected to your own local government is watching who comes and who goes. Your license plates become your name becomes your address, and information about who attended these meetings can eventually find its way back into the same industrial world where you have to earn your living. Now, let's be clear. I don't know if people got fired, but in 1970 Milledgeville, I'm pretty sure there are plenty of stories to back up that claim. Right? But I'm not going to create evidence that doesn't exist. But you don't need a firing list to understand how fear works in a small town. Somebody thinks the boss knows. Somebody hears somebody got called into the office. Somebody hours got cut. Some believe they're being treated differently. And then word started traveling. You heard about old boy, he got fired. Say he caught him up there at the Holiday Inn. Yeah, they said them union cards will get you cost you your job. Now, I know something about that even today. I deal with confidential sources who give me information and immediately tell me, Lamar, please keep my name out of this. I still have to work here. I still have to live here. Nobody arrested them. Nobody put handcuffs on them. But they're afraid of what somebody with influence might be able to do to their life. Now imagine that same pressure in Milledgeville in 1976. Sometimes surveillance doesn't have to prosecute you. Sometimes knowing you're being watched is enough to change your whole behavior. All right. And eventually the secret got out. Alston provided information about what happened to investigators and the press. What had begun as a quiet operation inside a small Georgia city suddenly became something Milledgeville could no longer keep silent. Local newspapers covered it, Georgia newspapers covered it, and then the story traveled nationally. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Philadelphia Inquirer. The story involving Milledgeville mayor, the police department, industrial establishment, and the surveillance of a union campaign had reached some of the largest newspapers in America. The national attention had subsequent litigations are documented in Timothy Mitchell's history on the Milledgeville spy case. And once the story was public, people started having to answer questions under oath. Depositions were taken, affidavits were filed. The union brought a federal lawsuit, the ACTCWU versus Robert Rice and others, case number 79 90 MAC, in the United States District Court of the Middle District of Georgia. Meacham's research draws extensively from those depositions, including Robert Rice's April 25th, 1979 deposition. Now, the story wasn't rumored. There was a paper trail, there were sworn statements, there were names, and eventually there were settlements. Agreements were reached with people involved in the operation. Milledgeville police agreed that this type of spying would no longer continue. Grumman Aerospace, one of the local industrial participants identified in the historical record, agreed to pay the union 10 grand. J.P. Stevens reached his own agreement concerning surveillance, and the scandal had consequences beyond a courtroom. And in September 1979, Robert Rice resigned as mayor of Milledgeville. He officially cited personal reasons. Sound familiar in recent events? So I'm not going to tell you the scandal alone forced him out of office. But historically, his resignation came after the surveillance operation had been exposed and after the story had embarrassed Milledgeville far beyond Baldwin County. Rice eventually left Milledgeville for Atlanta, but the labor fight wasn't finished. In 1982, an administrative law judge from the National Labor Relations Board concluded that J.P. Stevenson had conspired with the Milledgeville city officials in the illegal surveillance of the organizing campaign. Now think about that. Years after people had first started meeting at the Holiday Inn, the historical record would ultimately describe what happened not simply as a couple of overzealous police officers taking down tag numbers, but as an operation between public officials and private industrial interests aimed at a labor campaign. Sounds like a RICO, doesn't it? And yet, there's one final piece that keeps this story from becoming a neat Hollywood ending. J.P. Stevens and Milledgeville never became unionized. The operation was exposed, lawsuits followed, settlements were paid. A federal labor proceeding later found unlawful surveillance, but the union still never won that plant. And that's where this story becomes larger than Robert Rice. Companies have been coming south for years looking for lower operating costs, lower wages, and environments where organized labor had considerably less power than it held in many northern industrial centers. For southern communities competing for factories, being non union wasn't always viewed as a problem. It could be marketed as an advantage, and Milledgeville wanted industry. That help explains why the possibility of a successful union campaign at one major plant could be viewed by local leaders as something that threatened far more than one company. They were protecting an economic development model. But that's another writer's room. Because what eventually happened to that model and what eventually happened when one of the Milledgeville major plants finally did organize years later deserves its own story. James Orange didn't stop either. He went on to spend decades organizing workers through the AFL CIO, leading labor campaigns throughout the South, and continuing to build the bridge between civil rights and workers' rights that had brought him into places like Milledgeville in the first place. The AFL CIO says Orange organized workers in poultry plants, sewing factories, and shipyards and remained a major labor and civil rights organizer until late in his life. Dr. Charles Wayman Alston lived until 2006. The man who had once worked alongside the political establishment ultimately became one of the people willing to expose what that establishment had done. Reverend E.D. Strickland had helped connect organized labor with established black civil rights leadership. And Oscar Davis' story was just getting started because the same Oscar Davis who stepped into this fight alongside James Orange would eventually find himself and another fight over representation. This time, not over who had a voice inside a factory, but who had a voice inside of Baldwin County government.